Professor Dale Whittington from University of North Carolina. Professor Whittington is a professor of environmental science and engineering, city and regional planning and public policy at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Since 1986, he has worked for World Bank and other international agencies on development and application of technique for estimating the economic value of environmental resources in developing countries. He has been working with so many countries that I can't count, including Haiti, Guatemala, Mexico, Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Tanzania, Pakistan, Nepal. Still going, it will go. I'm really happy to have him. He has a lot of knowledge on that area. And that's the floor is to you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen here. I don't have a long presentation this morning. I mean, this is going to be mostly a discussion, but I do want to make 3 points just to begin our discussion today. I want to say just a bit about the filling of the Gerd, and then I want to talk about the economics of the Gerd on Egypt a bit, and then I want to say a few things about the role of the international community and the negotiations over the Gerd. I do want to, before I begin, I just want to refer you to an excellent presentation that Dr. Kevin Wheeler made this week at the UCLA webinar series. You can use this link to get to the Kevin's presentation if you haven't seen it. We'll put that in the chat. So I'm not going to repeat, what Kevin did at the UCLA thing, but I do want to make a couple points about the filling of the Gerd, because I think there has been some confusion in the press on this. There's a high probability that the Gerd can be filled without causing significant harm to Egypt. Kevin and others made this analysis in the article on the left in Nature last year. And it's very likely that Egypt will be able to continue to release 55.5 BCM from the Aswan High Dam while the Gerd is being filled, and will not experience any water deficits. The Gerd is a hydropower facility. It's not consumptive use. And importantly, Kevin made the point that right now the Aswan High Dam is full. High Dam Reservoir is full. So what's most likely to happen is that as the Gerd gets filled, the Aswan High Dam will be drawn down, and then it will recover again without Egypt experiencing any water shortfalls. But there is a small probability that Egypt will experience some deficits during filling. This would occur during a multi-year drought while Ethiopia attempts to fill the Gerd. The bottom line here from the negotiation point of view is I think that at least from a technical point of view, it should be relatively easy for the riparians to reach an agreement on filling. So there's, I think, among the technical community, there's really a growing consensus, particularly among the hydrologists and the water resource engineers, about the key issues in the basin that the Gerd poses. My second point is this is not true about the economic impacts of the Gerd. There is a lot of misunderstanding about how the Gerd will affect the economies of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. There are two recent papers that have been published. The one on the right is a recent 2021 paper on Egypt's water deficit published in Environmental Research Letters. The one on the left has been published in the journal Water just in 2022. both of these papers say that there are going to be very large economic losses in Egypt due to the Gerd. I think if there are any Egyptians watching today, I would just say that both of these papers are wrong. And it's surprising in some sense that they were published in serious scientific journals. I do think it's really important to follow the social media in the riparian countries to understand how this kind of information spreads. And I think it complicates the negotiations. Kevin and I, with others, are writing rebuttals to these papers, but we can talk about the papers if you want. But if you just step back for a minute and you think, well, what would I need to do as a technical person to understand the economic impacts of the Gerd on the economies of the riparian countries? I would need a good water resources model, a good river basin model, and I need a good model of the economy. And neither of these papers have either one of these things. If you go back to this slide here, on the right, Mohammed Bashir, working at the University of Manchester with Julian Harou's team, shows how you can do this with a very fine model of the river basin and linking that model to the model of the Egyptian economy. So there is a large literature on the economic impacts of the Gerd and the Aswan High Dam on the economies of the riparians, but they're not really cited in these two recent papers. So my third message is about the role of the international community and the negotiations. From my perspective, I don't see much point, honestly, in resuming negotiations unless the riparians want an agreement. I have no knowledge, of course, personally, whether the three main riparians want to reach an agreement at this stage. But I don't think there's much to be gained from the international community trying to pressure the riparians if they're convinced they're better off now without an agreement. I do think that there's a need for a concrete draft agreement that represents a reasonable compromise between the positions of the parties. And I'm talking here about an actual text of the agreement. I mean, it could be the basis for serious negotiations. But there is one thing I think the international community could do at this point to facilitate an agreement, and that's an insurance a deal that would help Egypt deal with economic losses that would occur if there was a prolonged drought during the filling of the Gerd. There is a small risk, and it's reasonable for Egypt to want to protect itself against this possibility of shortfalls during the filling of the Gerd or after that during a prolonged drought. And I think the international community could play a key role in making such an insurance deal happen. So let me stop here and just some ideas to get us started in the discussion, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dale. Before we go to the next speaker, I just want to make a couple of public announcements. This webinar session is being recorded. If you have any questions, please submit your questions in the Q&A. I saw a couple of people raised their hands. We will not be taking voice questions due to the large number of attendees. So we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, and we will wait for the end to get to the question and answer session. Like I said at the beginning, those of you who might miss the beginning, we are giving quite a bit of time for audience interaction. Please, and that's the whole idea, send your question and then we will have those discussions. So going to the next presenter, that will be Dr. Edu Abraham. His research interests are mainly in application of numerical optimization, control, and system theory to advance water management and environmental engineering applications. Some of his research deal with optimization of multi-purpose reservoir. He has done quite a bit in terms of water energy for Nexus as well. The floor is yours, and thank you for joining us. Really appreciate. Edo, you are.
Yes. Can you see my screen? Is it
yes.
full screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Russo. What I would like to do today, perhaps, is kind of frame a little bit about how operational planning of water, energy, food infrastructure is done in a transboundary basin. Maybe talk a little bit about both long-term planning and then operational management. And I will show some results from this paper, which is done with my research assistant, and it shows some possibilities for cooperation and kind of the potential economic benefits for all riparian countries and under what conditions and so on. So I may skip through some things, but I hope later on we'll come to it in Q&A. So maybe I start with this idea that with a statement that we now have, I would say, multiple tools for integrated planning of water and energy and agricultural infrastructure, irrigation infrastructure in this weASPiRE Nexus context. And also we have, let's say, operational tools that are really detailed that could kind of pull together these infrastructures and simulate them to kind of find optimal allocation of water and optimal use of these resources. So typically we have, we now can build really detailed gridded models of the existing infrastructure, electricity grid. We can simulate these under different climate conditions, look at deficits. And so this is one of the things we do. So optimizing these operations themselves. So I will come to this. And then, of course, in long-term infrastructure planning, we would like to know, for example, where we would want to develop in Ethiopia, as an example, solar, wind, and hydropower, even outside the Nile basin, and cost optimally, and perhaps analyzing these kind of trade-offs in water use within the different sectors, within different users, regions, and this kind of analysis. So we really have these tools. So that's one concept or one point. And then when it comes to cooperation in a transboundary basin, of course, we also have already some literature. I think Professor Whittington already talked a little bit about this, showed some literature on the Gerd. But I would like to also point out things around cooperative game theory, for example, that look at specifically for the Nile basin, this work by Dinar and Nigatu, looks at water sharing under different water sharing agreements, whether water trade could be used as a way of cooperation, and also internalizing some kind of externalities like sediment management in a network of reservoirs, and then kind of allocating the water use optimally within the basin, and then paying for extra water used besides the kind of the agreed share. And what they show is that the additional kind of gains for these countries are actually small. And sort of the implication is that we ought to look for other ways of kind of enlarging this envelope for cooperation, I would call it. And in our work, what we look at is actually we have within Africa, even recently, free trade agreements have become operational. So we could look at free trade in agricultural products and in energy production. So as I showed earlier, if we're looking at long-term infrastructure planning as well, we should also look at these cooperative modes in the planning itself. So this is what I look at. So enlarging this core where it's actually beneficial for all parties, and therefore perhaps there would be more ideas, more possibilities for cooperation. In doing this, you would be looking at, because you have this spatial variation within the basin and agricultural suitability, of course, hydropower possibilities, or possibilities for solar and wind power as well. So this kind of increased specialization in energy and food production could be looked at, modeled in planning and operations. And you could also have things like regional self-sufficiency, which have, of course, kind of security values, and those could also be incorporated in such models. So this is something we look at. What does the model look like in general? You could have really, like I said, detailed gridded models of the actual water grid, agricultural lands, both rain-fed and irrigated agriculture. And we could look at optimizing the cropping patterns within the basin, regional integration of energy networks, or specifically, electricity networks, free trade zones, as I mentioned. And so then describing all these and solving these social planning optimization problems. Where should we grow what? Where should we produce electricity, when, and so on. So we build these kinds of models. We could also look at, we do also look at different levels of cooperation in managing these infrastructures. So one way is that we look at the unilateral scenario. So each country optimizes its economic benefits from hydropower production, from irrigation, and so on. And of course, trades within the region, in international markets, all the way to where we actually optimize for the whole region with constraints that in this regional scenario, actually each country does better than its unilateral case. So we can actually solve these kinds of mathematical problems. What we show in this work is that looking at historic scenarios with historic infrastructure, deterministic historic simulations, we show that cooperation scenarios result in significant gains for each country. Most of it for Egypt, because we also model the efficiency of production processes. And it turns out in Ethiopia and in Sudan, water productivity is quite low. So it's kind of the distribution here is not, it's not balanced, let's say. And we also show that, for example, just even by sharing information, that is flow, expected flow downstream, already for each country compared to the unilateral case, you get a lot of gains. And you could also, in this kind of work, what we could do is we could tease out where the kind of the efficiencies are, comparing agricultural water productivity spatially, explicitly within the countries. Of course, we can also analyze things like what in the food basket, what does it look like? How are these countries specializing, for example, shifting their production compared to the unilateral case, what is grown, to the case where they're coordinating their production processes. And then, of course, for today's discussion, we'll probably talk about Gerd as well. We also simulate with the Gerd in place and looking at irrigation expansion in Ethiopia. Even in those cases, what we find is the same thing compared to unilateral cases. Ethiopia and Sudan and Egypt all gain significantly in $1 billion per year. What we find is also that Ethiopia, for example, expanding its irrigation results in let's say, significant increases in income or benefits compared to just selling electricity through Gerd. And then to emphasize and go back to the water sharing concepts and cooperative game theory, is that actually in our simulations, for example, with the Gerd, with all these significant gains for Ethiopian coordination, we see only around 11% reduction in flow at Dongola. So that's actually, under normal, what you call fair allocations, that would be way less than what Ethiopia would be allocated. So cooperation scenarios do cushion this kind of reduction downstream. And so the message from me would be, yeah, we should be planning infrastructure under these conditions, assuming these conditions. And then, of course, I leave to the other experts on social sciences and on the political economy on how do you institutionally make this possible. I'll stop here for now.
Okay, just also update, as you saw, we have 4 panelists, but for some reason, one of our panelists is unable to join us and I did not get a message. We will continue ours. If he join us, we will come back to him. The next panelist is Dr. Abdul Karim. I'm really happy to have him. Dr. Abdul Karim is the country representative for Ethiopia and the regional representative for the International Water Management Institute. Sometimes people call it IWMI. Before that, he was the Deputy Executive Director and the manager of the basin-wide program for the Nile Basin Secretariat. Dr. Said led, as a specialist, led, probably some of you heard, a very good tool, the Nile Basin Decision Support Tool, which is the first comprehensive and analytical tool jointly developed by the members of the Nile Basin Initiative. I'm really happy to have him, and the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see my slides?
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. So I have a few slides. Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Trusa, for the invitation. Thank you for organizing the forum. And it was really a pleasure listening to Dale speaking about the Gerd and then the more bigger optimization problem, especially by Dr. Edo. On the expanding the envelope of cooperation, which somehow my presentation also talks about. I will be focusing more on the bigger issue of cooperation rather than focusing on the Gerd. So just to give you just a refresher, I just want to give first highlights of the water resource base in the Nile Basin. I'll be focusing really on the Nile Basin. So what you see now displayed is the rainfall pattern, and what is peculiar here really is the Nile. One of the complexity of the Nile arises from the fact that really very small area of the Nile Basin gets rainfall or sufficient rainfall, let's say, and that is the source of water for the rest of the basin. So the vast area in the north, the reddish or orange colored area in Sudan and Egypt are arid or semi-arid or desert with very little internally generated water. Upstream, although there's quite substantial amount of rainfall, there's also an issue of high unpredictability of the rainfall because of not only climate change, even under natural variability, like for example the Blue Nile, which provides the bulk of stream flow to the Nile, is highly variable between years and between seasons as well. So this is really a challenge. We know more than 70% of the population, especially in upstream countries, depend on rainfall for agriculture, but they are increasingly facing this rainfall variability, especially during the growing season. And that's one of the major drives why governments prefer irrigation. When it comes to the stream flow, as I've said earlier, the runoff is generated really in relatively small area of the Nile. I just want to give this highlight. The annual runoff usually is given as 84, but work by NVI gives an estimate between 84 and 91. I'm just quoting the number from the State of the Nile River Basin report issued by NVI in 2021. But also groundwater. There's also a substantial amount of groundwater in the Nile. So especially what you see on the right-hand side of the slide, the pictures, 2 pictures, one in the middle shows the transboundary aquifers. The other one, extreme right, shows the groundwater productivity map for the Eastern Nile, prepared by ENTRO, the Eastern Nile Technical Regional Office, part of NBI. There is some potential or substantial amount of groundwater, especially in what is called the Nubian sandstone aquifer, But the challenge, of course, is this is not renewable. And this is also very deep aquifer with huge like extraction costs. So whichever resource you see, there are challenges. Come to the surface runoff. If you really focus entirely on the blue water, river water, that's quite small compared to the demand on it. Rainfall is highly variable, highly unpredictable. Groundwater, to some extent, where you have most of the resources against the deep groundwater and non-renewable, especially if you are talking about groundwater for agriculture. Sorry. Now, given this resource base, when you see the current situation in the basin, especially this is a basin, especially most countries, they have substantially unmet demands or basic needs, actually. What you see here in the upper left corner is the percentage of population using improved drinking water. You see most of the countries really, the percentage is very low. What you see here is Egypt, obviously. This is again from the State of the Nile Basin report by NBI from the 2021 report. And what you see in the lower side is access to electricity or electricity consumption, kilowatt hour per capita per year. This is from 2010 figure. I also checked 2024, there's not much difference, very little difference. So most of the countries really have very, very low level of access to electricity or electricity consumption. Whereas, you know, especially in upstream water source area, there's a substantial amount of water which has not been developed yet to any, you know, appreciable extent. That's why this figure from the World Water Development Report 4 shows, you know, the water scarcity by, I mean, what you call physical scarcity, where the resource is not available, and also economic scarcity, where the resource has not been developed. And this, again, we have huge population, right? Very rapid population growth. The Nile Basin, this is the number of the population size projected by 2050 to exceed 1 billion. This is for all Nile Basin riparian countries. And when you see from 1950, the total population in all the countries around 84 million. And now, sorry, by around 2050, it's going to exceed about 1 billion. Then you can see, you know, the pressure is really mounting on governments to do something about like meeting the demands for water, food, and energy of growing population. But one other point which I would like to highlight is not only the total number of people here, but also we have the huge use bulge in these countries and huge unemployment rates, and which could potentially lead to instability in these countries. So developing the water resource, not a question of only economic development, but also rather really has also a security and stability, you know, perspective as well. When you talk about climate variability, again, investment is very important because we are talking about water, food, energy nexus, and investment in these systems. This is what you see here is from a report by Hall and others, which is about coping with the curse of freshwater variability. And what you see here actually is the coefficient of variation of monthly runoff to just indicate the variability of runoff. Then again, is investments, increasing investment. So it's what you see here, the green dots are developed nations or high-income countries, whereas the red dots here are low-income countries. So you see here, the low-income countries, generally, they have low level of investment, although they also have high variability of runoff. And as an example, I'm showing here the seasonal, you know, variability of or variation of runoff of the Blue Nile. So investment in food, water, and the energy systems is really absolutely essential for these countries to cope with climate variability, but also to meet the growing demands of their population. So the challenge for the Nile really is you have, you know, part of the Nile, mostly downstream, with very little internally generated water, although potentially there's huge groundwater potential as well, but high level of dependence of their economies on the Nile. This is one side from the right-hand side here, and from the left-hand side, which shows the condition in most upstream countries. There's very big or rapid population growth, economic growth in many of the countries. Climate change applies for all. There's increasing water demand, food demand, energy demand. There's a big pressure to expand infrastructure. The question now is, for a transboundary water resource like the Nile, given this contrasting resource endowment and demand situation in the basin, how do you develop this kind of resource without, or in a way that will be as less painful as possible for everyone, and then as win-win as possible for everyone or all countries? In the history of the Nile Basin cooperation, always there has been two perspectives, unilateral development pressures on governments that said, because population is increasing, the food, water, energy demand are increasing. So there's a big pressure to develop the resource. On the other hand, this is a transboundary, and we'll talk about the river flow, it's a transboundary resource. So there are attempts to do this through cooperation, not really, especially when it comes to investment. My own view is not so successful when it comes to infrastructure investments. So there are these two perspectives or two contrasting contexts. On the national level, there is urgency for to meet the development needs. There's a demand pressure on governments. But on the other hand, when you look at the transboundary perspective, of course, you want countries to work together. But at the same time, there's increasing recognition that infrastructure investments you do through cooperation usually take time, as you can understand. They are very much process-oriented. And that could be frustrating for some countries. So that will reinforce, again, unilateralism. Again, that will possibly lead to some more conflict or more tense relation between countries. So to this also, what also complicates to a greater extent, I can say, is the historical and legal, context, for example, and the perceptions and, the huge trust deficit the Nile countries started with when they started their cooperation through the NBI in 1999. So given these two perspectives, what is the best way forward to harness the water, energy, food opportunities or system opportunities the countries have in a manner that will be conducive for all countries to meet their growing water demand, at the same time sustain the Nile River itself, because the river is also a stakeholder in this. Now, I have some thoughts on this. I'm just more for discussion. My understanding was these are just issue framing or issue setting presentations so that we can have discussion more. In my view, investing in infrastructure, investing in infrastructure in food and water energy systems is absolutely important for these countries. Otherwise, not only the growing demands are not fulfilled, but also the peace and stability of the region will be at stake. So now, how do we do it? So due to the high seasonal interannual variability of the river flow, in my view, any meaningful utilization of the Nile requires storage of water. So when we talk about storage, we need to invest in integrated water storage, not only dams, but also groundwater reserves, soil moisture, etc. So meaning looking at storage from a bigger perspective, not only the gray infrastructure we normally, talk about. Then, especially when it comes to dams and reservoirs, there's a big improvement we can do in terms of optimizing the use of water if countries really coordinate the operation of the dams. Especially in the last decades, hydropower was or has been the major drive for dam development in some upstream countries. But looking forward, probably we need to think about harnessing other energy resources, other renewable energy sources like wind or solar or geothermal, including hydropower, because hydropower alone, a study done by NBI has shown that hydropower alone is not going to meet all the energy requirements of the countries. And the other thing is, if you remember what I showed at the beginning, I really want countries to talk about how best to utilize their diversified water resources, not only the river flow, what we normally call blue water. So we need to exploit the full potential of rainfall agriculture with supplemental irrigation, groundwater for irrigation, etc. All diversified source of water. When it comes to the cooperation, I like the idea of expanding or enlarging, I think, by Dr. Edo, enlarging the envelope of cooperation. I'm talking about that one here. At least the last 20 plus years through NBI, what I am familiar with, the cooperation has been really very much water centric. So people talk about water shares, water quotas, for example, but probably we need to think really, if we try to expand beyond the just sharing the pie of water or the water itself into more broad-based cooperation, could that help in unlocking the current impasse? I put like a question, probably. I feel like, what really matters for the bottom line for the countries really is to meet the demands of the growing population. Water is critical for that, we know that, but the amount of the goods and services you produce from a given quantity of water really depends upon the technology you're putting in. So for this reason, water as a quantity itself, although it has been driving the cooperation dialogue so far, probably we also need to think about how to broaden or expand the envelope, as was the term used by Dr. Ibrahim earlier. So the last point I want to make really is, especially when it comes to scientific community, the advanced tools for analyzing complex decision problems in transboundary cooperation will help really. That will bring you back to the point number 2 here, we just skipped earlier. Basically means, although transboundary water management challenges, they have dual nature. They are technical as well as political / legal. So the scientific community can help in showing different ways of like using the resource or developing the resource in a manner that will really address the needs of all countries. So this kind of information would help even the dialogue. And then probably the countries could embrace more and more technical solutions that would be more win-win and more optimized from the resource usage perspective. So I leave it there, and thank you for your attention. Back to you, Dr. Russo.
Okay, thank you very much for that excellent view of big pictures. I really appreciate, and we have gotten quite a bit of questions, and please, folks, continue to send those. And we'll come back. The last but not the least is Professor Yakov. He had some challenge joining us. I'm so happy that he's able to join us today. Professor Yakov is a professor of hydropolitics of Northeastern Africa and the Middle East. He is a graduate of Addis Ababa University, Ohio State, and the University of Zurich. So he has the big picture of many places. He has published numerous articles, co-authored books, and contributed books chapter as well. One of his book, I think from 2007, about the dilemma of national and regional hydropolitics is a good one if you want to check it out. His main teaching and research areas are hydropolitics, water governance, geopolitics, and regional security in Northeast Africa, as well as in the Middle Eastern. He is an advisor for the Ethiopian Ministry of Water and Energy. Currently is also part of the negotiating team on the Gerd. Professor Yakov, great to have you, and happy that you made it as well. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Trousseau. I'm pleased that I appear on this presentation panel. I listened to all the presenters. I'm very happy about that, but my picture did not come up. So I'm sorry about that. You hear me?
Yes, we hear you very well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think my intervention will be very short and very basic. I want to put some words to what you already know, I suppose. This is about water sharing. Water is shared. I think we all know that. Water is shared at the local level, at national level, as well as at transboundary level. So this water, the water thing, is very important as a very important resource for our life, not only for our physical life, for our social, cultural life, economic life. We all know that. But what people might miss is that water is shared. So water flows from one point to another. It's also known. And at all points, people share, communities share, and nations share. I think that is very basic to understand how countries are obliged to put institutions, to put agreements, to put mechanisms of sharing and using water resources to its best possible potential. So it's also important that water resources are connectors, not dividers. But we have to discover the very positive aspect of that water resources connect communities and countries, but we have to find right methodology and right mechanism how to positively utilize that connection. Internationally, this has been very well understood and realized that the UN members negotiated to establish an international principle for water resources which are shared. I'm talking about 1997 UN Convention on Shared Water Resources. So this has been signed and ratified by majority of UN members. So their shared waters should be addressed in such a way countries must agree and must be very careful and considerate to utilize water resources within their territorial boundaries in equitable and reasonable manner. At the same time, not really causing significant harm to other countries in the basin. But this is very important message, an international accepted principle. In further developing this, the Nile Basin countries really sit down, negotiated for 11 years. They came up with an agreement known as Operative Framework Agreement. And that agreement has been really, to much extent, drawn from international convention, which was developed and signed by the UN members. There also the same principle of sharing water resources in equitable and reasonable manner, developing it, using it, and not causing significant harm to others. That was also a commitment by the majority of the Nile Basin countries. And in fact, in the context of Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan negotiated very intensively, and they came up with a declaration of principles. There also, they more or less agreed that the Nile is shared, and the eastern part of Nile is shared. Therefore, they address sharing of the water resources in the eastern Nile in the context of Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in equitable and reasonable manner. So this theme of using water resources in equitable and reasonable manner, since water is shared, not causing significant harm to others, has been really something which has been more or less a consensus by international community. at UN level as well as at the basin level. But when we come to the Nile Basin lacks really institutional and regional legal mechanism to put real operational, commitments in the sharing and using the water resources together, cooperatively. In the absence of this institutional mechanism, countries have been utilizing their part of the water resources that flows in their country, passes through their countries in unilateral manner. That's what we have observed, how the highest one dam developed, how dams in Sudan developed, all of them, Sennar or Aulia or El Girba or, Meroe or Rosaris. It's in the same way in Ethiopia, a lot of dams have been developed unilaterally. Just, in a traditional manner, Nile Basin countries have no cooperation tradition, and countries cannot sit idly, from away from utilizing the water resources. That is why each country has been using it unilaterally in their best way possible. And Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has also been developed in this manner. Therefore, my message would be that countries, whether they are in the upstream or downstream, must realize that the water resources are shared. No country can claim monopoly of the shared water resources, whether they are at the beginning of the flow or at the end of the flow. Therefore, what they have to focus is, politically speaking, geopolitically speaking, from the practical point of developing water resources, they must really focus on enlarging the pie rather than monopolizing the pie. If countries focus on enlarging the pie, then they look for best possibilities of the potential that they can develop the shared water resources within their own country. And also other countries do the best use of the water in their own countries in such a way development in one country can be complementary to development in the other country. That really puts the countries working into enlarging the pie rather than vying for controlling totality of the shared water resources or monopolizing of the total water resources. That being my final message. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob, for joining us. I would like to introduce Magdalawit Masai, one of weASPiRE members, to take us through the Q&A and in the final segment. Magdalawit Masai Derive is a doctoral student at Florida International University. Her research focuses on long-term sustainable and equitable utilization of transboundary water resources with a specific interest on the Nile Basin. She has a Bachelor's of Science in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Addis Ababa Institute of Technology in Ethiopia, a Master of Science in Environmental Science from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and a Master of Science in Hydraulic Engineering from Addis Ababa Institute of Technology in Ethiopia. Magdalawit is actively involved in the Nile water use discussion. She has done her master's thesis on equitable and reasonable use of Nile River, written several opinion pieces, and contributed to numerous panel discussions on topics. Beside her academic engagement in the Nile, Magdalawit is also involved in the social advocacy around the Nile Basin. Like, she's very active in weASPiRE, working to illuminate the multiple stories and narratives across the basin and fostering dialogue with the hope of bringing people together, creating a shared understanding, empathy, and a culture of peace in the basin. With that, I will pass it on to Dr. Toruso to summarize the previous topic discussed by our participants. And then we have several questions received from attendees. And I would like to thank everyone who's following this webinar. Today we have some time for a Q&A. I'm happy that we left enough time for discussion. So with that, Dr. Trousseau, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I would like to thank all our panelists. Excellent discussion. We are going as we just planned. The idea was to have the first hour frame setting opportunities, and then the next 1 hour. So we have 1 hour for Q&A as well as any additional thoughts. I just want to mention that we heard a really great presentation, starting with Dale. I think one of the things I took from him was that some of these countries may not be wanting to negotiate. So we have to figure out why that's the case, as well as some of the scientific presentation will come back that may not help in that direction, bringing togetherness, cooperation as such. Those are excellent reference you heard there. With Edo, I think interesting thing I captured also is that we need to expand the envelope of cooperation. We have few questions. I have prepared a few questions as well, and some of the things how we actually get to there. We saw in terms of sharing information, sharing data, sharing this planning, and how these kind of things could be a reality. I know that most of us are, I wouldn't consider myself, but in the research, but we have to figure out how we translate this into some actionable, actionable information that others could use. Then we heard from Dr. Abdul Karim. I think he covered a lot of ground there, including the why we don't have, I will have a question later, why we don't have actually a conjunctive water use. That includes both surface water and groundwater. Understood that some of them are non-renewable, but some of them are. You saw some of the challenge in terms of variability of climate that impacts how we manage, as well as the increased stress in the watersheds through population growth. So stresses like climate as well as population growth are huge. And as we move forward, I think we have to look how we can work within this constraint. It is clear to me that it is better to work with a bigger boundary than individual countries. Then we heard from Dr. Jacob some of the background as well as the water sharing issue, and then a little bit of history as well. Point well taken, looks to me. I think you, Dr. Jacob, also in a way stressed what Dale at the beginning said in terms of why these countries and which direction they are going, as well as what they selected for what reason. These are excellent presentation. Like I said, we have 1 more hour for Q&A and others. So I'm going to start. This is what we're going to do. I'm going to start, come to the presenters, 1 question for everyone, and then Magdalawit has additional. She was putting together some of the audience questions. So mine will be prepared by myself. So I will go first for each of the panelists with 1 question. And let me start where I have. So I will start with Dale. You mentioned about some of the challenge in terms of studies. I think you put a couple of papers there in terms of things that are not helpful. And I really appreciate you shared the webinar by Dr. Kevin as well. I'm one of the other group who are challenging actually one of the paper. But the question I want to raise is that media tends to pick this kind of papers, and it just blow up in terms of unnecessary headlines, just create more tension. And the academic process to rebuting this kind of studies takes time. For example, ours is submitted in July. Still, it's this is not decided. So you can imagine you have these 6 months, 8 months. By the time you reach there is a lot of damage the media has done in terms of creating unnecessary tension. How do you see that beyond scientific rebuttals? What should we do for such kind of case of, I consider really not defensible studies, some of them?
It's a great question, and I don't think the scientific community focuses enough on communicating with the public and civil society on what they agree on. I said that I think there is a growing consensus among the hydrologists and engineers about the effects of the Gerd and the real issues. And I linked, I sent the link to Kevin Wheeler's presentation, which I think, that's an example of one way of dealing with, this social media tension is scholars like Dr. Wheeler, trying to rebut, bad analysis. I mean, in real time. I mean, getting things out on YouTube and forth. I don't think the scholarly community's done enough on this. So I take your point. It's a really conundrum at this point. I don't think we were quite prepared as a scientific community, either the technical side or the economists, the policymakers, really to try to deal with this social media phenomenon that we're really seeing. It's a new problem for us. I mean, many times academics want to be heard and they aren't heard, but in this age of social media, sometimes they get heard too quickly. And, so I don't have any good answers for you, but I think you put your finger on a really important problem in the basin and globally, where we have an extra responsibility in the scholarly community to ensure the quality of what's published in the journals and what we're saying.
Thank you. The next one goes to Dr. Edo. It's a two-part question I have for you. You show, given a cooperative scenarios or historical simulation, I believe that you showed what happened long-term in terms of the water, energy, food nexus, optimized cooperation. But as the countries develop and their need change, perhaps there may not be a lot of incentive for them to cooperate. I mean, looking ahead 20, 30 years, what could happen? How do you see we figure this problem? And related to that, you also showed that this water, energy, food nexus cooperation brings additional benefit to everyone. But in the future, there may be a lot of different new water, energy, food infrastructure upstream, and perhaps more competition for water in the upstream countries. Would there be even a space for cooperatively managing resources as you show? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, a really nice question. So I think they are connected. Okay, long term, would there be space for cooperation? I think my answer would be yes. In fact, I was listening to Abdul Karim's points about conjunctive water use and that we haven't utilized it. And I think if you look downstream, we know that in Egypt, for example, there are huge resources, that could go for 100 years, but they're very deep and you need energy for those. Huh? And so if I think long term, as technical people, we can actually analyze all these possibilities. As I showed in my first slide, we can consider all these scenarios globally. What would the markets look like in future? And I think Abdul Karim also showed that the kind of the population grows and the needs that are going to develop in these countries. So we can actually model these, and we can say, okay, what kind of infrastructure do we need? So in that sense, if we explore in the whole basin, what is the most cost optimal way to kind of meet those demands, and then we know how to also model technologies. So we have learning curves for different technologies now. We have renewable technologies and how they would develop, etc., their cost and so on. We can simulate all these things. So in principle, we can look at that space, and that's the kind of work that I'm doing. And I'm very much convinced that there would always be a bigger pie, so to say, or a bigger envelope for cooperation than if you were to just do things unilaterally. Maybe another thing to kind of worry about, and my message would be also, you have, if you plan infrastructure unilaterally, then you may have lock-in kind of capital in some infrastructure that is not really conducive to cooperation. So I think that's what you're implying in your question, perhaps. So that would be something to avoid, I would say. So what are sort of, if you think long-term 2060, and we have a pathway towards kind of meeting certain demands, what are the kind of infrastructures that would not lock in, capital and are not going to be, cost effective, etc. We could do these kinds of analysis, and I think if I look at the EU where I live, I work within the energy sector, and there is market integration even in the grid. That's the kind of stuff we model. So the electricity markets are being integrated. And each country is kind of planning renewable integration, but it's also in line with global drivers like climate change mitigation targets. Now we have the Green Deal in the EU and in the US as well. Similar kind of equivalent targets are being set. So I think if we kind of track these targets and look at what are the most cost optimal way that will meet the demand. And in a Nexus context where we could actually really optimize efficiencies of all resource use, land, water, and renewable energy resources, then we will have these answers. So I have no doubts that this won't be an issue in future.
Thank you, Dr. Edo. The next one, since you called, you referenced Dr. Abdul Karim in terms of conjunctive water use, that was actually where I was going. Dr. Abdul Karim, you showed the not only surface water, but groundwater resources. Some of them, yes, true, they are not renewable, but there are also shallow groundwater that can be used in a conjunctive way to at least use it during a drought. Weather the drought, as I would say, but we haven't seen that. So what would it take for us to, within the Nile Basin, that people would actually use in a way that is combined? I can give example what we do here. In drought time, you get to the shallow well and so on, and then when you have more surplus time, you go to the surface water. You may store it, or also put in the ground as well. How do you see this playing out? And that's my question, the first question. And related to that, most of the time with the food energy nexus, and later on, Edo, you can come back to this as well, there is an embedded water sharing issue as well. How do you see solving that underlying issue of water sharing, whether it's bundled in the energy or other? How do you see that as well? So if you could please elaborate on those two. Thanks. You are muted. Okay.
Yeah,
thanks.
no, yeah, I was expecting that you'd ask me that question. Good. When it comes to conjunctive use, I think it's a question of scale. So why I'm saying that is that's already happening. If you see, when I was in NBI, we were also like studying countries' documents as well, and some level of groundwater use, even for irrigation, is being practiced in many countries. Although in most upstream countries, groundwater is being used for domestic purposes, but increasingly, using it for small scale irrigation is also happening now. It's a question of scale we're talking about. So just this is one on the fact. Just to mention, the UMI has developed, for example, solar irrigation suitability map for Ethiopia, where largely using solar irrigation pumps from shallow groundwater. So there is already increasing recognition by many of the countries to use water in a conjunctive manner. Just a few days ago, I think, from Tuesday up to Wednesday, there was a conference of the IGAD region. Many of the IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, countries also are also members of NBI, a specific conference on groundwater. So this groundwater conjunctive use has all been emphasized very much. So it's a question of scale, really, and countries are coming to it, in my view. But you know, it requires quite a lot of investment because there's a huge gap in the knowledge on groundwater resource distribution. That is one important factor. And the other one is the pumping costs as well. If you're talking about groundwater, then energy resource, it becomes very important, especially in rural areas. Now, you know, solar irrigation is being promoted, but again, it has also its own pluses and minuses, especially the huge initial investment cost. I mean, huge means relatively to the economies of the, you know, the communities in rural countries like Ethiopia or other, you know, upstream Nile basin countries. So in my view, this is already starting, it's happening, but it's not to the level you would really want it or you see it in elsewhere in the developed world. And I think countries are moving in that direction, in my view. There's a huge, huge call for that. Now, when it comes to water sharing,
Yes.
the point you mentioned, well, I was thinking really how to respond to that question, but look, if you see the cooperative framework agreement, what the Professor Jakob mentioned, to the extent I understand, it's really focused on river water, on the river flow, in the river water, in the river system. I think there was a purpose, in my view, why countries focused on that. And don't forget, this negotiation on CFA started in 1997. So, you know, at that time, maybe there wasn't much knowledge, or there are many other reasons why countries really focus on that. But what I really would like to say is the groundwater resource or the rainfall, they don't have to be on the table for sharing. I mean, that's not the only way of using them, in my view. So if a country, for example, taps on its groundwater resources and makes better use of rainfall, even if it's not discussed in the water sharing negotiations, it is contributing at the country level to, you know, for increasing the food production or energy production, depending upon the case. And that indirectly is really contributing to transboundary cooperation because you know, transboundary water management, for several reasons, countries really focus on the river system. It's very difficult to change that, in my view. Given the current situation in the Nile, I'm not very optimistic. Countries would like to, you know, bring all the resources, you know, on the table. Although I know when the CFA talks about equitable and reasonable utilization, one of the factors they consider that will be considered is availability of alternative resources or water sources like rainfall or groundwater and so on. But that is an indirect contribution. So really my view is the more countries also make best use of rainfall and the groundwater, the more it will ease the pressure on the river system, which also indirectly contributes to the negotiation on the river, around the river system itself. That's how I look at it. And I don't expect countries will really talk about how to share rainfall and how to share the groundwater as well. The other thing which I would like to highlight is really, you know, if you go to upstream countries of the Nile, most of the population depends on rainfall agriculture. I don't think it is likely that this will be automatically converted to irrigation, I mean, it will take a lot of time. And I don't think it will, I mean, in my view, for the coming few decades, still rainfall agriculture is very important, still remains very important sector. So enhancing the effectiveness of using rainfall in the rainfall system is very important. And then I think that will also contribute indirectly to the transboundary cooperation on the Nile itself. So to summarize, I don't expect the water sharing discussion between the countries will include groundwater rainfall, although except as a factor in equitable utilization. But the more countries tap also into groundwater and rainfall more effectively and in a conjunctive manner, it will indirectly contribute to ease the pressure on the river system, which in a way will contribute to the transboundary cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next one is for Professor Jakob. I think we heard some of the background, including some of the agreement 2015. If I use one of your sentence and then tied back to what Dale said, it looks to me that there is quite a bit of challenge for these three countries to get to reasonable negotiation and going forward as well. So water sharing still is there, issues there. What must happen now going forward? Because it is clear to me that, and it was demonstrated through this water energy food nexus. There are so many other studies. They say that you get the best out of it if you cooperate. To what level, how these countries are wanting to do that is a question. But how do you see that we need to get there? That I think that's issue. I don't think it's a matter of us not knowing what's going to happen and how cooperation help us, but it seems that everybody wants their own interest and so on. So how can we break that? And given your experience on the negotiation and others, how do you see must happen to bring everybody that's acceptable to all of them?
Thank you very much. I think this is really a big question. Countries, especially those who are in political will, should think about this. And the experience of negotiation through years. First round of negotiation, like my colleague Abdul Karim mentioned, the CFA, it took a lot of time. The whole question boils down how to make best use of the shared water resources. So the issue of shared water resources is not really debatable. Every country shares a portion of the Nile. But the best thing is that the countries did not go into and did not want really to take the example of controlling any amount or any portion of the water resources. Majority of the negotiating riparians really agreed after long negotiation that the whole point is to establish cooperation and to establish mechanism for cooperation. And through that mechanism, countries can put their plans, their wishes, the best possibilities of developing water resources in their countries without really putting the other countries into jeopardy. So that was the whole idea. There will not be any physical sharing of the water resources. This cannot be accepted. That's why I was actually sharing my view that no country, by the virtue of being the source or by the fact of being the mouth of a river, in this case Nile, can control or should control the water resources or take any portion, bigger or smaller, for itself alone. So the question is, sharing is how to make the possibility of developing the water resources with the best potential in each country. So the operation goes to sharing the benefits, sharing the the results of putting the development in each country, the shared waters, into best fruits. So I think this is the whole idea. In the future, I think countries can and should realize that unilateral approach to water development in each country is not sustainable. It creates more complications. That is why they have to establish mechanisms. They have to establish legal and institutional frameworks for this in order to expect who can have the best possibilities of utilizing in which best water use sector, hydropower or food production or other things of this potential. So in the future, I think this is the question the countries must really realize and should realize that this is share the resource over which they can exercise their best wishes and enlarge the possibilities of cooperation and benefiting from each other's creativity and economic planning in which they can also participate at one or another level. So the future is, I think, quite challenging, but the task is quite clear. There is no way that no country can monopolize or claim monopoly, whether there is an agreement of such a nature or not, it doesn't matter. So I think that is what I would think. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are going to pass to Magdalawit for asking some of the audience, because these are all my prepared questions. But before I pass that, I have a few things that I want you to think. And when I come back later on, based on time, Abdul Karim, I think I agree with you in terms of rainfall, that, especially rainfall translated into river flow, the whole thing, some of them, a lot of it is ET that goes out. But in terms of groundwater, how do you think? Because even the 97 agreement, most of the time cited the water course. So it includes groundwater and surface water. So how do you see that playing in terms of the getting into this negotiation? You don't have to answer now. And then for Dale, I think I remember some time ago, your presentation, which I like, you said that when you mention about what happened in Washington, you said that these three countries actually missed the opportunity to just agree on the first filling and hey, cheers, and then build partnership and build confidence, and they can go and tackle the next very difficult one is comprehensive water sharing. So I want you to reflect on that and to explain us when we come back. For Edo, the water sharing issue, I would like you to answer as well within the water food nexus. And then now I'm going to pass it to Magdalawit so that we address, as we promised, the audience question as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. This is turning out to be a very lively presentation. Lots of important issues from different aspects are being raised, which always makes for a full understanding of the issue. I'll first start with questions for Dr. Dale Whittington. There's a question in the chat that says, why are all the modeling studies being done with the assumption or expectation of allowing Egypt to get or release 55.5 billion cubic meters, which is obviously pointing to the 1959 agreement? Even the drought managements are designed so that the Aswan High Dam does not go below critical levels, which is based on the assumption that the HAD gets 55.5 BCM. As modelers, we understand that you need a baseline to model harm or damage, but this is an obvious issue for Ethiopia and the other countries as well. What would you say to people who are skeptical of the implications of these studies for water allocation?
It's a great question, and I think it's really unfortunate that this baseline issue didn't get sorted out with the consultant studies 6 years ago. I mean, it would have been much more productive, I think. Looking back, I don't think we realized what a lost opportunity that was. I mean, the studies could have been done with alternative baselines. This is not something that is so common in the water resources field, but other professions are much more tuned into this idea that we need to look at different dynamic baselines. So there was a disagreement between Egypt and Ethiopia on the baseline issue, and the consultant studies could have been done. If you think of it as a sensitivity analysis, they could have been done with Egypt's baseline, and they could have been done with Ethiopia's baseline, and they could have been done with Sudan's baseline. And I think that would have been, in retrospect, a very useful thing to do. Unfortunately, it was never done. The consultant studies never got going. But I would say, that should be something under consideration, to go back and try to get a scientific consensus on the importance of the baseline and understanding the economic impacts of the Gerd. I think it's a great question. And I don't, yeah, I think the analysis could have been done with alternative dynamic baselines, and that might have been a very, I'll say, productive dialogue between the countries.
Another question for you is, given the evident benefit of the dam, why rehash information claiming economic damages to Egypt? I will let you respond to that, and then we can move on to the other speakers.
Could you repeat the question? I'm not quite sure I understood it.
It says, given the evident benefits of the dam, I'm guessing to downstream countries, why rehash information claiming economic damages to Egypt?
Well, there's two parts of that. I was showing those two papers that were claiming that there were huge damages to Egypt as something that I considered incorrect. So if you call it rehashing, I was really trying to emphasize the role of misinformation in the current controversy. So I was disputing those two papers. I wasn't rehashing it. On the other hand, I think it's important to realize that Egypt does have a real risk. It's a small probability risk, but if a multi-year drought occurs during the filling of the Gerd, this is going to be a problem. And I think there's no, I think the technical community understands this quite well. And what I said was that I think that's a role for the international community to help ensure Egypt against the damages from that unlikely but very real scenario. I don't think there's any nothing to be gained here by denying that Egypt could be hurt in a multi-year drought during the filling of the Gerd. I mean, they would be, and I think it's, you know, if this was one country, I mean, it's not, but if it were one country, the upstream riparians would certainly be concerned about the damages that would occur downstream under that set of conditions.
Thank you, Dr. Withington. Okay, moving on to questions for Dr. Ido. There's a question in the chat that says, it is good to cooperate on infrastructure development to have more benefits. However, there are significant unilateral infrastructures that cause, that critically spoil the cooperation in the region and also hinder, and their legacy also hinders the current as well as future cooperation. How does the regional cooperation become free from the legacy of these unilateral infrastructures?
It's a very difficult question, but yeah. I think Professor Withington kind of now partially answered it. So we're talking about, even when we're talking about the HAD as the Aswan Dam, we're talking about stranded assets in a way, yeah? If we say we have now a new water sharing agreement, and let's say Ethiopia has 37%, and then if you have multi-year droughts, and then suddenly the HAD is no longer kind of satisfying its intended use. So that is a problem for Egypt. So I think that is something that has to be settled, both long-term. For example, Egypt could, in our work, for example, we see kind of when you optimize cropping patterns, the kind of the social planner says that we should go away from unproductive agricultural practices. So that means some livelihoods would be lost. That, of course, that is an economic problem. That is a social planning problem. Huh? It's not a, so then that's also a political problem now it becomes. So that is quite complicated. But this is something that has to be faced, and we have to quantify this. Who benefits, who loses, who pays for it, and the political implications, of course, nationally have to be dealt with. So yes, it is a problem. But then we could also, these baselines, or whatever you may call them, we could take these into account, and we say, okay, what is the kind of the most effective new infrastructure, and how would we avoid these stranding of assets, or livelihoods being lost in future? So this is something that has to be done cooperatively, and it's not a technical problem. It's not just a mathematical problem, because we can plan. We can find alternatives that say, okay, what is the least harmful for everyone, and who pays for that? Is it the international community? Is, you know, there are some distributional questions, fairness questions that should be asked. Yeah. But fundamentally, I mean, the water sharing question comes back, because you could say, you know, multi-drought years, Ethiopia could sell the water, and then what's the value of that water, you know? And this is a big question. So we don't really have kind of the infrastructure there, the institutional infrastructure for doing this. I don't know how the NBI has not been effective, perhaps, in achieving this over 20 years. Perhaps it has tried, you know, it's just, but others could comment on this. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ido. Another question for you was, what kind of water cooperation model can these countries search for? Or do you think there are any theoretical systems that they can learn from? I'm guessing they were referring to your Nexus model.
Oh, okay. Is this, so models, I think there are multiple models developed by lots of technical groups. I think the Manchester University group was mentioned, I think, some of the slides of Professor Whittington at TU Delft in the Netherlands. We have quite a few models. There are international integrated assessment models that are global, that can be scaled down to do this kind of assessment at you know, country level or in a regional level. I think the NBI itself has decision support systems, which some of my students have studied. How effectively it is being used by countries, this decision support system from the NBI, for example, I don't know. Perhaps Abdul Karim can comment on this, but I don't think technical tools are the limitation. And then the question, if it's alluding to a kind of real examples of cooperation and in a transboundary basin, I think we have multiple good examples in the US. Of course, we have the Colorado River Basin, you know, in Europe as well. Here we have some river basins where there's amazing levels of cooperation, even in environmental protection, you know, going past the kind of the economic questions of using the river infrastructure. So yeah, there are working examples. Yeah, but that's, I would say, beyond the scope of my my expertise. But yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. The next set of questions is for Dr. Abdul Karim. There was one question regarding aquifers. It says, given the occasional massive floods, has anyone studied the feasibility of using aquifers as a source for water conservation? The reader says, I recently saw a program about Libyan investment to access groundwater. Considering we can access groundwater, why not design the access to include storage during flooding times?
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent question. Yes, there has been, or there are already attempts to use floods actually for recharging groundwater aquifers. And I personally was not involved in those studies, but in the conference I was participating a few days ago, quite a few papers were presented actually on case studies, partly what they call managed aquifer recharge, and but also like using, you know, flood water to recharge aquifers. I can link the person who asked this question to some of the experts at UMI as well, who could give him or her more information about where this has been practiced. What I can say generally is this is still very early stage, but this practice is already there.
Okay.
Floods are being used to recharge aquifers. That's a very good question. Yes.
Okay. I think it would be.
So if I can have the address of the person, then I can link him with experts on this.
Wonderful. Okay.
So let me add one more question to you, because it came from our audience, and this Abdul Karim. This is the question of drought. The question was that shouldn't all the country be sharing drought? I believe what they want to get at is that Climate change, for example, change things. It could be variabilities, but the drought, we know that the drought comes at some point. And some of the study shows that if there is a multiple drought, that's where there could be an issue to Egypt High Aswan Dam as well. I can speak my experience on how the Colorado River Basin does here. In fact, for the first time in their history, January 1st, 2022, they instituted the first cut of their share from 3 of the state. So again, I guess the question is, why is not possible for everyone to share drought?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think I saw it also, I think, on the chat. If you ask my opinion, yes, you don't only share rewards, but also you share the risk, obviously. So I personally believe that the countries need to share also the impacts of the drought. So it's not only on one country to bear the burden of the drought. I mean, I don't have any doubt on that. The question is now how to do it. You see, if you think of a hypothetical situation where we don't have these borders between countries, let's say with just one country, the entire Nile Basin, then obviously, you optimize the use of water in drought conditions and in normal conditions, or in times of water abundance, obviously. And there are many solutions for that. There are many tools for that. The imperfection comes when you have the borders, and many other factors come into play. So otherwise, as a matter of principle, I think that is where the countries should be heading, in my view, sharing the rewards but sharing also the risks. Yeah, obviously. But NBI was, I mean, just to give a little bit of more supplement to, I think, what Dr. Edo was saying about this unilateralism as well. I mean, we need to be really realistic here. I don't expect unilateral development of projects will cease, I mean, the coming years, a few years time, because we are far away from it. So we need to be like thinking of how best, countries can cooperate, given that some of the projects are really unilateral. There are many reasons why countries go unilateral. I have also tried to highlight some of them. You see, normally, like big projects, like dam projects, they normally take lots of time. We know from the time of inception up to the realization of a dam project take 2 decades, 3 decades. And add to it, this process of multi-country cooperation, again, that will take a lot more time. So, but the need doesn't give you so much time. The pressure on governments doesn't give you so much time. So that's where one of the challenges. And I always ask myself, if I were in a downstream country position, I want countries upstream to really be readily cooperate on their projects. I just ask, why don't they ask, I should ask myself also, what kind of incentive can I give upstream countries so that they can discuss their projects with me? Because it is of mutual interest that they share the information, they collaboratively plan, because they can not only minimize impact, but also they can also maximize benefits to all of them. So, but unfortunately, that kind of process, I don't see it happening. So that's where the really challenge is. And I share the views of Dr. Edo on that. So, but I'm really realistic on that. I don't expect unilateralism to end anytime soon. But we can still help countries, especially through tools and new information, for example, make better decisions given the imperfect, actually, transboundary cooperation.
I see Dr. Yacob raised his hand. Dr. Yacob.
Yeah, go ahead. You are mute.
So I'm just moving my my ballpoint by taking notes, not raising hand. Thank you.
Well, the next set of questions is actually for you, so nice that you chimed in.
You can stay there.
Very good.
Okay, so there's one question in the chat that says, Ethiopia's distributed energy source composes of 90% from hydropower. How does Ethiopia plan to address this issue moving forward to optimize the energy sources by diversification? Maybe others can chime in as well.
Yeah, I think that 90% hydro power source is, what actually is. But the government policy, as far as I read, is to diversify, the energy sources with, wind power, geothermal, and other small energy sources like biogas is not significant. But I think the government has been planning, and it is also in the recent policy document, that diversification is not only the intention, but the commitment of the government. I think this will change. I think Ethiopia has a lot of potential. Everybody knows, hydropower. I think that is the best option to be the highest proportion of energy source in Ethiopia. I think that is what has demonstrated, but this is going to diversify. I think government is committed as far as I read the process. Thank you.
The second question is in regard to the negotiation process. It says, in your opinion, how does the upcoming negotiation evolve after Egypt and Sudan placed the Nile Guardian joint military front close to the border? Does Ethiopia ask first if this is a threat to be moved away from this border?
I think there are reports that Sudan and Egypt has been moving, claiming and showing some cooperation for potential protection of their water or whatever interest. I think the negotiation has started, a long time ago. It is more of a dialogue, and this dialogue is continuing now. It has been continuing, I think, under the facilitation of the union. Now a third chairman is going to take the office next month. Then the dialogue would continue as long as Egypt and Sudan are willing to come, not boycotting some of the sessions. I think this is in the best interest of Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt to continue dialoguing. If there is any possibility of agreeing on some points where compromises as possible, I think that is the best option they must be looking for. But otherwise, military threats and so on do not change the course of the water and do not really change that Egypt and Sudan are downstream countries. But that does not change that Ethiopia is an upstream country. And that does not replace not only the possibility, but also the obligation of basin countries to negotiate over the utilization of the shared water resources. I don't think this is really a big issue. I think they should not obstruct negotiation. Egypt and Sudan should not use this as a mechanism of threat. Put forward what they want to be happen in their own terms. So I think their option is not something I personally share. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Just before, we got so many great questions from the audience as well. I want to go back to one of the question I raised earlier. So I will go to Dale. I mentioned what you said in one of your presentation regarding they would have been better off if they just agreed the first filling and consider that as an accomplishment and then tackle the more challenging comprehensive water allocation and all those issues. So could you elaborate, and how do you see things going now, and how do you see it should go, and what can we do that, to get to what you just said on one of your conference I heard?
Well, thanks for the question. This is a very complicated negotiations. I'm really not trying to offer too much advice for the negotiating parties. But I do think if you think about Abdul Karim's call for cooperation and Ido's call for cooperation, it's very hard to get there without some kind of agreement on the Gerd, right? I mean, we all kind of know where we'd like to end up. We like the parties to end up, thinking beyond the river, beyond the Gerd, with, economic cooperation running in all kinds of directions. But it does seem to me that the first step in trust building here would reach an agreement on the Gerd. And my sense is that the filling issue is not that complicated from a technical point of view. I understand the water sharing is very complicated, but perhaps there could be an agreement to keep talking and to deal with this small but real risk to Egypt of damages occurring during filling if there was a prolonged drought occurred at the same time. I mean, I think, you can get through that, pretty small probability. I think, there's a pretty easy deal to be had. Why not go ahead and do that? That was my argument. So I still think that makes some sense, but there may be other confidence building measures. Kevin Wheeler had a series of confidence building measures that he mentioned in his talk yesterday. That all made sense to me, but I think in order to get to the kind of cooperation that Ido and Abdul Karim are talking about, it's hard to see how you get there without an agreement on the Gerd, at least in my view.
Yeah, again, like I said, we are getting a lot of questions. We will wrap up this at 12 sharp, and then before that, so I have one question that can be addressed by Dr. Abdul Karim and Edo. I just want to get there. Both of you said, I'm actually a little bit, how can I say? The Abdul Karim, I think from the practitioner perspective, what you said, it makes a lot of sense to me, and I would not call it discouraging, but I think you nailed, you hit the nail on the head in terms of what's the reality. As a practitioner, I agree on you as well, but this is for both of you. So for example, Edo, you outlined in terms of this idea of planning for new infrastructure, dams, irrigation, and whatever renewable energy project. Should we plan in cooperation within the framework of water, energy, and food nexus? However, I'm not sure that even this is happening within the individual countries as well. It looks to me that energy infrastructure or others are being done in silos within every country. That's probably not the most economically beneficial based on, I can see from your research. How do you envision that we break this? It's only me, and then go forward. So for you as well as Abdul Karim, that if you could elaborate on this.
Abdul Karim, please go ahead first.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I will. Look, Dr. Russo, thank you very much. I'll give you one example, what NBI is doing right now. It started quite a few years back. Especially the NBI did what they call strategic water resource analysis, which means NBI tried to pull all the planning from planning documents, all the infrastructure projects which are planned by the countries up to 2050 or so time horizon. And they put it in their modeling framework, and they projected the water demands and try to show to the countries, really, if the countries go business as usual, which means largely uncoordinated development, the countries are going to face very soon huge water deficit. This was presented to the Council of Ministers, and there's a technical working group representing the countries, and they came up with several options to explore. So the idea there really is through technical work to show to the countries a better, maybe a more sustainable way of accommodating the developments upstream or realizing those developments upstream in a manner that will also, don't be so like disruptive to, water availability elsewhere. So it's trying to find a balance. That's going on still. And that is moving into what they call a basin-wide investment program. The question of Nexus comes here. So bringing together the energy sector, the agriculture, and then not only NBI, trying to bring on board other actors in the region, because there are also other actors in the region, like the East African Power Pool, the Lake Victoria Basin Commission, IGAD, for example, the COMESA. It's not easy, but they are trying. They are trying to bring everybody on board to have a fairly comprehensive investment program that will try to see different scenarios of development, because the development needs of upstream countries is real. So it's not something like, it's not like a luxury. So at the same time, they want to like to also, take into account the apprehension of the downstream countries as well. And, bring this together through different ways of scenario planning. They are trying to help member countries to figure out how best to move ahead together in terms of infrastructure development planning. This is being tried right away now. So this is one way of doing it, because really, if you need cooperation, institutions are important. All right. And if you need cooperation at the same time, the tools and information is also important. The countries need to talk to each other as well. So what I'm trying to say is it's not easy, but it is happening. But it is happening very gradually. And that's probably the nature of things in transboundary cooperation. So, the hope I have is that will get a breakthrough so that, member countries will move ahead together. But I believe in incremental, development, not really this comprehensive development, putting everything together in a master plan. That's not going to work. But because if you see the development plans in the countries, there's a huge plan for expanding irrigation, new dams, etc., etc. But that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. So if the countries see the next 10 years, then what can they work together in the next 10 years, for example? So that incremental planning could help countries also find a way of solving problems together. I think that is very important for the process, because in transboundary cooperation, process is very important in my view. So again, on the groundwater sharing, groundwater being constant, water sharing discussions. Yeah. I see it a very gradual process, and more of indirect, yes, increasing use of groundwater by member countries, and that will indirectly contribute to it. But on the table, sharing also groundwater, I'll really be, it will be a positive surprise to me actually to see it happening very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will be wrapping up. So Edo, if you could add in a minute or a minute and a half, adding this.
Yes. I think Abdul Karim really nicely showed it. And I'm also very positive. I'm not pessimistic about the silos going away, because I think a lot of investment now happening. You mentioned the power pools. They're really planning regionally, because they want to have the investment to really pay back. And so these deficits you see are really driving people to rethink institutions. In Ethiopia we had a ministry of of the Nexus even. I'm not sure how that's gonna work now, of water, energy, and irrigation. I think those things also help. Having all the planners in one roof. And I think the developmental agencies as well are now, the main cheerleaders of kind of integrated planning long term. So I am positive. I'm not, although there's still some planning happening in silos. I think even large irrigation plantations, that I've worked with or talked to, even those are, thinking about their own energy security, really thinking about what it costs them long-term, medium-term. So I see this integration to continue. And then, like Abdul Karim said, a lot of the infrastructure is also not happening overnight. So I think this development would mature by then and would help. So yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. And before I pass to Samson for a closing remark, I really want to say thank you so much in spending your Saturdays and busy schedule. I understand that, and you gave us excellent presentation. I just want to remind folks, this is one of the 4 webinars. We call it town hall because we wanted to give a lot of interaction for audience. And as you realize, today we gave 1 full hour for Q&A that really gives additional information for everyone. And again, I will thank my colleague here, Makralawit, also collecting all some of the questions and helping me as well. And with that, I will pass it to Samson.
Thank you, Dr. Truso. I would like to echo what Truso just said. Thank you for your time. As Truso said, this is one of the 4 webinars that we're planning. In the past, we had speakers from Uganda, Sudan. We want to expand this to all, Africans in Nile Basin countries, and we want to have a dialogue, a peaceful dialogue. We welcome speakers from Egypt, to come here and present opposing viewpoints and have a civil discourse and, a dialogue. So weASPiRE is very happy to be able to host this webinar. Before I close, as you all know, Ethiopia and Sudan are really going through a tough time with internal conflicts. As on behalf of weASPiRE, our collective hearts are heavy with sympathy, and we extend our most heartfelt condolences to all the victims and also all sides, and we pray that peace will see a chance. Without peace, we can't do anything. So we really pray for that, and I thank you for your time. Those in Ethiopia, dinner is ready. Those of you on this part of the Atlantic, lunch might be ready. So thank you.